perhaps if we turn to the emergence of consciousness, you mentioned earlier you thought there might be some disagreements in our worldview, and I wonder if this is where that comes in.
Before we do that, let me say that in this Santiago theory, cognition is always associated with life at all levels of life. So a simple bacterium is able to perceive things in the environment. It has some sensory apparatus, very, very simple sensory, what should I say, organs, if you wish. And it perceives things in the environment and it responds to this perception. It can move in one direction or the other. It can follow light. It can perceive electric impulses. Some bacteria perceive magnetic fields and so on. So there is perception. There is a self-organizing cognitive response at all levels of life, long before we have nervous systems and brains. And as organisms become more and more complex in evolution and have become in the history of evolution, their physical structures are more and more complex, and so are their cognitive processes. So the process of cognition, or mind if you wish, and the physical structure increase in complexity hand in hand. And at a certain complexity, there's the emergence of coordinating organs like nervous systems and brains. And at that level of complexity, at some stage, certainly at the stage of mammals, but also with some vertebrates like birds, for example, there is the emergence not only of awareness of the environment, which is true for all cognitive processes, but self-awareness, the awareness of a self. And cognitive scientists today talk about transitory states of self-awareness, and they call this primary consciousness. And as complexity increases into the, we move into the great apes and hominids and humans. We then have a permanent self-awareness, and we speak about human consciousness. And with that permanent self-awareness, you have the emergence of conceptual thought, of values, of language, and there's a whole inner world that emerges. And this is, I think, where we are at the forefront of cognitive science. And as you say yourself in your paper, this has been called the hard problem of consciousness research, to explain how this inner world of ideas, of conscious awareness, of thought emerges from the neurophysiological processes of the brain. That's where we are today. And I have not seen a really, a theory that convinces me, but in my view, in the work that I have studied, Antonio Damasio has gone maybe the furthest in trying to explain this emergence of the inner world of consciousness.
Right. And so it sounds to me like similar to Antonio Damasio's work, there's this emphasis on the nervous system and its ability to create abstract kind of images or symbols, one of those being of the self. And so in this view is the idea that in order to have consciousness, and as you say, this kind of inner world of experience, there needs to be a self, there needs to be some psychological structure corresponding to the kind of organism.
Well, then there needs to be, according to Damasio, there needs to be an image of the self. So his theory basically says that in the human brain, there are certain structures, certain neural networks that monitor the entire state of the organism. There is a neural map of our blood pressure, of our hormonal processes, and in particular of our response to encounters with objects in the environment and things in the environment. So this neural network, these neural maps are maps of the state of the organism and its response to environmental influences, and they have been developed, they have evolved so as to enable this complex organism to respond to things in a self-organizing way and to keep track of things. And this is what Damasio calls the proto-self, these neural maps. They are not conscious. And then he says, when these unconscious neural maps become conscious, this is the process where the self emerges, and he emphasizes the role of emotions in this process of making the neural maps conscious. And he interestingly distinguishes between emotions and feelings. He says that emotion is a biophysical response to events. When we get angry, our blood pressure changes, we get red in the face and so on. So it's a physiological response which helps us in survival, which was evolved very early on in evolution. Most organisms have that, an emotional response to the environment, a whole pattern of physiological processes. There's also, the fight or flight response that is well known. Stress is part of it, and so on. So those are emotions. And then when we become conscious of an emotion, then it's a feeling. And the making conscious of the proto-self to become a self critically involves emotions that then become feelings. And this is why Damasio says consciousness is a feeling. So, not consciousness, the self. The self is a feeling. And the title of the book in which he describes this theory is called The Feeling of What Happens. And that's actually his definition of consciousness. What happens is the environment. The proto-self makes the neural map of what happens. And when it becomes conscious, when it becomes a feeling, then that is consciousness. But in my view, and Damasio has not solved the hard problem of consciousness studies, because he doesn't describe in detail how it becomes conscious, the process of it becoming conscious. If you read his book carefully, you see that he does sort of a sleight of hand. He glosses over it, And I actually asked him about that. I met Damasio many years ago at a conference, and right 5 minutes after we were introduced, I said to him, Antonio, I think you haven't really solved the hard problem of consciousness studies, have you? And he immediately said, no, I haven't. So, he's honest about it, which is great, Yeah. He didn't sort of say, well, this is the theory and that and that and that. But he said, no, I haven't solved it.